Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone who is attending our session today. My name is Natalia Sinaeva-Pankovska, and I'm a Holocaust and Genocide scholar and museum educator, and I represent the Never Again Association, an organization which is based in Poland and which aims to commemorate the Holocaust and other genocides through research, education, and awareness raising campaigns, and promote peace and dialogue. This session is arranged as a part of a Liberation War Museum global virtual conference on commemorating past and learning to prevent atrocity crimes. During the session, I would like to encourage you to post your questions in the chat box. So if you have any questions or if you have any comments which could be interesting for our panelists, so just use the chat box and put questions there. And please also, I welcome you to share your country and your name, from where you're coming from. So because we have very diverse audience today, and it would be interesting to learn from where are you coming, you're attending our session. I learned about Bangladesh history and difficult past and genocide perpetrated against Bangladeshis during my visit to the Liberation War Museum for the first time in November 2019, during the conference organized by the museum. And I was impressed by what the museum is doing to raise awareness and commemorate atrocities committed 50 years ago in different ways, and especially engagement of a younger generation, young people, young Bangladeshis, and at the same time bringing attention to contemporary atrocities such as against Rohingya. And I'm very honored to moderate this session today within this conference and with very special speakers. And I'm very grateful to the Liberation War Museum, to the museum trustees and volunteers for inviting us to co-organize this session. The topic of our session is the Holocaust and genocide, distortion and hate speech. Good understanding of Holocaust path, understand also other genocides, mass atrocities, and human rights violations, and contribute to prevent future crimes. Denial is commonly known as the last stage of a genocide, which is accompanied by dehumanization and demonization of victims and whitewashing perpetrators' crimes. There are different strategies and mechanisms that deniers use, including teasing the suffering of victims, manipulation, word replacing, guilt transfer, self-praise, among others. And there are also common processes and mechanism, patterns, and understanding of Holocaust denial distortion may help us to understand also other genocides, denial or distortion, and importantly, to think about counter-argument and counter-strategies. And here I would like to show the slide number 2, if possible. So, yes. Today, as I said, we have 3 speakers with different backgrounds. And each presentation from each speaker will last for 15 minutes. And after the presentation, we will have an important Q&A session and discussion. So, but if you already have your questions during the presentation, please use chat box and leave your questions and comments in chat box. The first presentation will be delivered by Jan Tomasz Gross, the special meaning and significance of Holocaust experience and commemoration in Eastern Europe. The second presentation will be delivered by Mark Weitzman, Holocaust and Denial in the West. And the third presentation will be delivered by Dr. Rafał Pankowski, Identifying and Countering Holocaust and Genocide Distortion, Lessons for South and Southeast Asia. And I would like now to move to the next slide, please. And I would like to introduce our first speaker. And we are very honored to have Professor Jan Tomasz Gross. No, yes, this one. Have Professor Jan Tomasz Gross with us today. Professor Jan Tomasz Gross is a Polish-American historian, and he's lectured at Princeton University, New York University, Yale University, in Paris, in Vienna, in Krakow, and all over the world. And he is the author of a groundbreaking book, you can see of his book, Neighbors: The Destruction of Jewish Community in Jedwabne, which was published in 2001, as well as Fear, Anti-Semitism at Auschwitz, Golden Harvest, Events on the Periphery of a Holocaust, and many other books. And his books have been translated in multiple languages, including Polish, Romanian, English, Swedish, Hungarian, Russian, Italian, and many other languages. His books, especially Neighbors, have played a background role in the conscience of Eastern European society. He has drawn attention to the role of the local population, neighbors, in the Holocaust across Europe. And he has inspired local Polish European historians and generations of historians, I would say already, in advance, to study the complexity of a genocide and initiated a crucial debate concerning the relationship between Jews and their Christian neighbors, anti-Semitism and post-war violence against Jews in and beyond, which was accompanied by hate speech and unwillingness to deal with a difficult past and build critical identity in the post-totalitarian era. So, Professor Jan Tomasz Gross, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Natalia, for this introduction, and thank you to the organizers of this big, wonderful conference for the invitation. I would like to start with a brief statement and kind of an overview of what Holocaust meant as an experience, if you will, how it unfolded in the East, so to speak, in the eastward of Germany. As we know, Holocaust is this horrendous episode in the history of Europe, where essentially 6 million Jews who had lived on the European continent and found themselves in the years 1940, 1944 under the occupation and under the rule of Nazi German state have been killed basically through a very deliberate and organized effort of the Nazis. What's specific about the events in east of Germany, so to speak, is the particular ferocity of the process which had been implemented there in order to carry out this mass murder. Essentially, even though the war starts in September of 1939, and persecution of Jews is a phenomenon that we register from the very beginning. Among other things, it also includes ghettoization. Again, not everywhere. What's very important to keep in mind is that the pattern of German occupation changes and is different in different parts of Europe. I'm not going to go into it, it's an endless subject. But the great ferocity of assault on the Jews dates from a time when Nazi Germany attacks Soviet Union. We're talking about the summer, about June 22nd of 1941. And it is a moment from which the killings, mass killings of Jews begin immediately. The form of German assault on Jewish communities which they encounter, and let me just step back for 1 second. It has to be kept in mind that a great majority of European Jews lived prior to the war eastward of Germany. So if you think about 6 million Jews being killed during the Second World War, I'd say almost 5 million out of this horrendous number of victims had been Jews that lived east of Germany. That includes the toll of 3 million Polish Jews who had been killed during this period. When German assault on the Soviet Union begins, in the minds of Hitler and his subordinates, to whom he communicates orders, this is a different kind of war. This is a war of extermination, as he puts it. And it implies ferocity not only on the battlefield, but a very brutal and ruthless treatment of certain categories of the civilian population. And one of the categories that is right away marked for extermination are Jews. So the process of killing, and that's something that we have to keep in mind because we associate with the Holocaust, and rightly so, the image of extermination camps, in other words, special sites to which Jews are brought from all over Europe, actually. These sites, isolated sites typically, where they are killed en masse through essentially the process of sending them to gas chambers. True as it is, this involves the killing of the bulk of almost of European Jewry, is essentially only one part of the mechanism of mass murder that is deployed by the Nazi perpetrators, and this is a crucial aspect, their direct helpers whom they find among the local population in the areas that they invade. So in the initial wave, you have this story whereby scores of Jews will be killed essentially in their places of residence or in the vicinity of these places of residence. In the last 20 years, an important scholar, he became a great specialist in Holocaust history, a French priest by the name of Patrick Dubois, started investigating and marking mass graves of people, of Jews who had been killed during the war, precisely in the eastern part of Europe. We were talking about these killings taking place near the residential areas where Jews lived, and killings that took place in essentially in sort of open spaces, if you will. Dubois called them Holocaust by bullets to distinguish this process of killing from what I have just mentioned and what we know and typically associate with Holocaust murder, namely gassing of Jews in extermination camps. Now, in Eastern Europe, both things take place. Extermination camps are situated in Eastern Europe, in occupied areas that Germans have conquered there. The ferocity of the process and the involvement of the local population at various stages, stimulated and invited to do so by Nazi invaders, but also prompted by all kinds of motives that come together with this deeply entrenched in the ideologies, if you will, that were prevalent before the war in the area. Anti-Semitism, for example, a kind of ethnic hatred, that's another very powerful motivation. Finally, what also plays an enormous role here is that context in large swaths of this territory where Soviet rule had been imposed in Eastern Europe at the beginning of the war. War starts with an agreement between Hitler and the leader of the Soviet Union, Stalin, and essentially there is a division of occupation zones in Eastern Europe between the two of them. A lot of motivating factor for people to assist the Nazi troops, but also special detachments which are fielded right away in order to kill the Jews that follow the frontline troops, the so-called Einsatzgruppen, which are deployed on the Eastern Front with this deliberate task, among other things that they do, but one of the tasks is really to kill the Jews. So one of the motivations is also to respond, as it were, and to kill in the minds of the local population as a kind of a revenge process for the imposition of the Soviet rule. In the minds, as part of the stereotype of anti-Semitic ideology, if you wish, was also this sort of association that's perennial to anti-Semitism anywhere in Europe. Also in those parts of Europe where there hadn't been any Soviet rule at all. Association between Jews and communism, Jews and Bolshevism, Judeo-Bolshevism. There would be a kind of a slogan that fuses together the two elements, if you will, of and then for those who are rabid nationalists and anti-communists, that's in their minds a way to somehow pursue their cause by assaulting Jews as an embodiment of Bolshevik evil as well. To make a long story short, what we find in Eastern Europe is a process whereby, first of all, in that sort of first wave, when the Jewish population is encountered by the Germans as they move very quickly, these initial killings take place, and in addition to Nazi SS squads and soldiers, local militias that form in the area participated. This whole process will last for 2.5 years at least. Between 1944 already, the whole thing, the German armies being pushed away from the area, and the area gets liberated slowly by the Red Army as it enters. Throughout that time, Jews will remain hunted. And in different phases, different moments, with different methods, they will be rounded up and brought to their death either in extermination camps or through killings in the field, so to speak. This presents, as the war winds down and these areas become, and Hitler gets defeated, if you will, in the end, the post-war commemoration of this tremendous catastrophe that took place, with very unique challenges. Frankly, as I'm sure you will hear in a moment when the story of West European experiences is discussed by Mark Weitzman, all over Europe, in all occupied areas, either institutions or individuals, local institutions and local people who also suffered under the German occupation. And what's very important to remember is that the German occupation in the east of Europe was just ferocious in violence that it addressed towards local population that was not Jewish as well. However, there is this additional burden that exists, if you will, in the liberated areas after the war, to confront the memory of Second World War and occupation. It's on one hand a memory of general suffering, suffering of the local population, and I mean by that people who are not Jewish or have not been singled out for extermination. That's one story. And alongside is the story of victimization of the Jews, in which local people have, in a significant extent, participated and contributed. And it becomes an extremely difficult history to recall with full honesty and kind of, if you will, transparency. It takes time before history of the Holocaust is told. In other words, because it requires the mounting awareness of a kind of a special suffering that has been imposed on the Jewish population. Locally, people are, and historians as well, and governments, of course, who organize public life are reluctant to do so. Eastern Europe finds itself for about 40 years after the war, from 1945 until 1989, in fact, under the rule of communist parties, which is a sort of imposed rule because of geopolitics and Soviet influence in the area. In Soviet Union, the idea of special status of Jews as victims of Nazi invaders is just a complete taboo, and so a kind of a confrontation with the authentic history of this genocide is something that's extremely complicated. And let me just, before I finish, mention two specific, if you will, strategies which have developed in the East of Germany, in countries like Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, in obfuscating the history of the Holocaust and the story of Jewish catastrophe. On one hand, there are historians writing very good things and very thorough historical analysis of what had actually happened. But then alongside with it, there will be a very considerable pushback by, if you will, the sort of hurrah patriotic, xenophobic nationalist segments of the public opinion, which will try to diminish in some way, dilute and obfuscate the experience, the unique experience of mass killings of the Jews by, in certain countries, for instance, by launching a kind of a narrative of double genocide that has taken place over there. On one hand, genocide that had been inflicted on Jews, of course, but on the other hand, genocide that had been engineered and carried out by the Soviet authorities, which had indeed, in the time immediately after the war and for some quite time thereafter, while Stalin especially was still alive, they have imposed incredibly ruthless regimes in territories in which they held sway. So instead of talking about Holocaust straightforward and articulating this issue of local participation in it, there is a sort of elision into the narrative concerning double genocide and just viewing victims as being all around, if you will, over there. And in a country such as Poland, which had not been directly incorporated into the Soviet Union, so to speak, but was in the Soviet bloc, but had a sovereign status as a state, and where truly astounding number of 3 million out of 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust were Polish Jews. What emerged as a pushback to the authentic history of the Holocaust, a narrative which puts forward the story of those Poles, and there were such people, of course, who were helping the Jews to survive despite these horrendous threats and danger of doing so. And the narrative that's pushed by the xenophobic nationalistic government is that this was the predominant way in which the Polish society responded to the Nazi policy of killing the Jews. This is false. This is not really a rendition of things as they were, and the heroism of those who were helping the Jews, in a large extent, derived and was grounded in the fact that they were an exception, outliers in their own society, and that they acted in ways that the local community disapproved and sort of spied on them, and this resulted in great suffering of the helpers as well, and very often they're being killed. I should end here because we don't have time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Gross, for your important presentation. And I apologize that we have not so much time to dedicate to this topic today, but I hope we will have more meetings in the future. And I found this presentation symbolically very important for this conference and for this particular audience. And I see now we have participants from Cambodia, from Poland, from Bangladesh, and also many people are watching us through live Facebook. So I think we're also learning a lot also already now from your presentation about what has happened in Eastern Europe. Thank you for this presentation, and we will have also comments and questions after all three presentations. And now I'd like to give the floor to our second speaker, Mark Weitzman, who is the Director of Government Affairs for the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and that Simon Wiesenthal was a survivor of Nazi death camps, and he dedicated the whole of his life to documenting the crimes of the Holocaust and to hunting down the perpetrators. And Mark Weitzman is also of the Movement Memorials working groups of International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And he is the lead author of a working definition of a Holocaust denial and distortion, which was prepared by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. He currently also serves as the vice president of the Association of Holocaust Organizations. And Mark will introduce us to Holocaust denial and distortion and historical perspective in the West. So, dear Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Natalia, and really appreciate the invitation to be here, and thank you and the organizers for putting on this immense conference with such wide global reach. It's really a very important initiative, and I commend you for it. It's also an honor to be here with my good friends Jan Thomas Gross and Rafał Pankowski, and I'm honored to be on the same panel as they are as well. I am going to try to follow up Jan Gross's masterful presentation, which gave a wonderful overview of our topic, and I'm going to try to get a little bit more specific. I have a number of slides that I will be showing, so moving very fast through some of them. I apologize for that in advance, and thank you, Iman, for taking care of the slides as well. But my topic is Holocaust denial and distortion, particularly focusing in the West. And I'm going to begin by going back to what Jan Gross was talking about, which was the Nazi efforts of the denial of the Holocaust that was built in to the Holocaust itself. If we go to the first slide, there are many examples of that. Perhaps the first slide, can we show, please? There are many examples of that, including the very language that the Nazis used, where they described the final solution as the Endlösung, not being very specific about what they were referring to. But in one speech in 1943 to his SS men, Heinrich Himmler, the director of the SS, which oversaw the concentration camps and death camps that Jan Gross talked about, mentions to his people very specifically that, and this is an English translation, I also want to mention a very difficult subject. It should be discussed among us. Nevertheless, we will never speak about it in public. The evacuation, the extermination of the Jewish people. Denial, covering up of the Holocaust was built in to the Holocaust itself at the very beginning. If we go to the next slide. So I'm going to now go to the after the war, post-war situation. And what I have noticed in studying this is that there are some trends that develop. And in the West, they develop in certain ways that are different from the developments that Jan Gross mentioned, which was the extreme nationalist, xenophobic response, and highlighting the rescue efforts of a small number and exaggerating their impact, which is taking place particularly usually in Eastern Europe today. But in the West, it took a little bit of a different sense because there was more of a sense of not being so directly involved, despite the history of collaboration and complicity in Western countries in Europe, without which the Jews could never have been identified or transported to their deaths. There was still a sense for many of these countries where the resistance narrative was prioritized, and the Holocaust narrative was kept at a sort of a distance, a little bit of an arm's length away. In France, which in some ways is where Holocaust denial in the West had one of its earliest beginnings, it appears in more philosophical and literary circles. So two French writers, Maurice Bardèche and Paul Rassignet, were some of the pioneers already in the late 1940s and early 1950s. They were writing books from a sort of a literary perspective or a critical perspective, targeting the Nuremberg trials, targeting, as you can see in, I don't know if you can see in Rassignet's letter from 1962, where we talked about the Eichmann arrest and trial and the Nuremberg trials. And he again goes into some forensic details about it based on literary analysis. And this is the beginnings of a certain trend in Holocaust denial that's continued later, if we go to the next slide, and really put forward by the French academic, literary scholar, Robert Faurisson, who died recently, a couple of years ago. And Faurisson targeted, for example, the diary of Anne Frank, the famous diary of a young teenage girl who was deported from Amsterdam and died at Bergen-Belsen, and became one of the most prominent witness documents of the Holocaust. Faurisson targeted this and raised questions of whether it was authentic, whether it was genuine, and so on, to the point where the Anne Frank Center actually issued a critical edition of the diary, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt, as if there was any question beforehand, its authenticity. But Faurisson became extraordinarily a powerful voice, a prominent voice in what was becoming a growing network of Holocaust deniers. And Faurisson targeted, or Faurisson checked into a group that was had grown up in the United States as well. If we go to the next slide. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned this. Another person of interest in this was a French philosopher, Roger Dorady, who actually converted to Islam and was a very prominent and well thought of philosopher or influential figure in certain circles in France, as well as in the Muslim world, was honored by Iran and Hezbollah. And Dorady tied the Holocaust denial myth into question legitimacy of the state of Israel. And he tied them together in a sort of literary, philosophical, political tract that also had wide dissemination, particularly in the Muslim world. If we go to the next slide. Next slide, please. So in the United States, Holocaust denial, and in the Anglo world in many ways, Holocaust denial did not take the literary, let's say, track that it was developed in French intellectual circles, but it was a much more hardcore historical approach, and it's genuinely credited or begin to have originated with a prominent historian at one point named Harry Elmer Barnes, who was a mid-century United States historian with impeccable academic credentials. But Barnes had been an advocate of the anti-German propaganda of World War I, which was highly exaggerated in World War I. Allied propaganda about the Germans was exaggerated. And when Barnes realized this, shortly after the war, he became a Germanophile, meaning, in other words, he became a friend of Germany. And in his 1930s writings already, he was subsidized and received money from the Nazi government. And after the war, he began to promulgate an historical approach to questioning both the size, the scope, and the reality of the Holocaust of the Jews by the Nazis. Barnes did not died in 1968, but if we go to the next slide, his works were picked up by a very successful insurance man in the United States named Willis Carto, who became financially the backer of almost every major neo-Nazi activity in the second half of the 20th century in the United States and in the early part of the 21st century as well. Carto is, I think, unquestionably the most influential and important figure in the neo-Nazi far-right movement in the United States over that 50-year period, approximately 50-year period. So Carto underwrote and created an institute in California, based in California, called the Institute of Historical Review, which did not deal with any sort of, it was not even an institute. It was actually literally a storefront in a small suburban California city, in a sort of a strip mall in there, and produced a pseudo-academic apparatus, such as a journal, a conference. It did not review history. One of the things we learned is that Holocaust deniers attempt to use legitimate academic apparatus and language. So they call themselves revisionists, which is legitimate historical pursuit of questioning historical, received wisdom beforehand. They were denying it. They weren't reviewing the history, they were denying it. Their footnotes, even though they were amply footnoted, were generally sprinkled among a circle of 20, 30 like-minded people, and they built up just a whole literature to support this edifice of Holocaust denial, and their conferences and journals reflected that. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Iman. Could we go to the next slide? So Carto Barnes was not the only academic involved with this. A man named Arthur Butz, who teaches at a prestigious American university, Northwestern, wrote a book in the 1970s or so called The Hoax of the 20th Century. But Butz was not an historian. Butz was a professor of electrical engineering. And this book became the most important book dealing with Holocaust or promoting the Holocaust denial theory in the United States, and it still is to this point. Next, please. And you can see Butz talking at the conference of the Holocaust deniers. And then they found a man named Fred Leuchter, who presented himself as the leading engineering authority on executions in the United States, gas chambers, executions, and capital punishment in the United States. He published a major report, supposedly claiming that his forensic work had shown that Auschwitz could not have murdered the amount of Jews in there, as claimed by the witnesses and survivors and scholars and et cetera of the Holocaust. Turned out Leuchter had no credentials and ended up having to face a legal proceedings in which he admitted he had no credentials, no ability to speak on this topic, and was totally and thoroughly discredited. Next, please. The director of this IHRA, the Institute of Historical Review, is another neo-Nazi who actually has a master's degree in history named Mark Weber. And finally, Weber in 2009 issued a statement where he said that in the real world, the reality is that the role of Holocaust denial was actually not to deal with the Holocaust specifically, but was actually aimed at Jewish Zionist power. In other words, he finally admitted the anti-Semitic motivation and rationale beyond Holocaust denial. And he actually said that Holocaust revisionism has proved to be as much a hindrance as a help because they could not gain traction and a foothold. Weber, by the way, had a falling out with Willis Carto years ago, and actually there was a split in the Holocaust denial movement. Carto lost control of his institute because he wanted to take it in a more racist manner, while Weber wanted to concentrate on the anti-Semitism and Holocaust, pure Holocaust denial. If we go to the next slide, we find that one of the reasons that Holocaust denial became in some ways marginalized on the West was because of the famous trial in 2000 between the British Anglo Holocaust denier David Irving, who you see behind the podium. Irving claimed to be a legitimate historian and actually had some, even though he was self-taught, had actually received some scholarly standing up to that point. But the American historian Deborah Lipstadt, professor in her book on Holocaust denial, pointed out Irving's lack of his anti-Semitism, his lack of scholarly, his slipshod approach to scholarship and so on, and in his attempt to whitewash the Nazis. Irving sued her for libel in London, where the onus of proof was on Deborah Lipstadt. This is similar to certain trials. Jan Gross has had a similar proceedings that he had to go through in Poland, where he had to prove that his work was legitimate and accurate and so on. But in a landmark trial, Irving was totally defeated in the case. The finding was 100% in favor of Deborah Lipstadt. Irving was thoroughly discredited in it and lost his whatever stature he had as legitimate historian. Next slide, please. So where do we stand today? I'm going to go through just a couple of more before I conclude. So today we see Holocaust denial in its hardcore impact, the David Irving type of denial, essentially marginalized in some extremist circles. It does pop up, though, in political discourse in the West in different ways. One of the ways is in certain radical left circles, as well as in radical Islamist anti-Israel circles, claiming that Israel is a Nazi state. And this is I want to be very clear here. This is not saying that Israel is above criticism. Anything Israel does as a state can be examined, criticized. One can disagree with it. But claiming that it is a Nazi state and trying to commit genocide of the Palestinians is absurd and essentially a false narrative. The next slide, please. And here you see a picture, again, in the next slide, a cartoon that just shows the comparison between what Jews experienced in the Holocaust and what Israel is supposedly doing to Palestinians today. The interesting thing about this slide, it was propagated as well by a former member of the House of Lords in the United Kingdom, as well as a website of the Education Ministry of the Flemish region, one of the three entities of the federal Belgian state. So it's not just, it had migrated from extremist circles into more mainstream circles. Next slide, please. Marine Le Pen, for example, who's a prominent politician, perhaps a leading, potentially leading candidate for president of France. In her last campaign in 2017, had to fire one of her leading campaign managers who claimed that, who quoted Holocaust deniers, questioning the use of the Zyklon B gas in the gas chambers in Auschwitz. And she herself said that she doesn't think France should bear any responsibility for what happened in the roundup of the Jews, the major roundup of the Jews of Paris before their deportation, even though there was a great deal of local collaboration from the Vichy government and the French collaborators in this effort. Next slide. So I want to show, what I'm trying to show here is some of the political implications of Holocaust denial and distortion in the West today. In Hungary, very briefly, here is a proposed statue to a Hungarian historian and politician during the pre-war and World War II period, who introduced the Nuremberg laws, the Hungarian version of the Nuremberg laws, which were the laws the Nazis created that stripped Jews of their citizenship and rights, and it was the basic underpinning of the legal attempts that led up to the deportation and murder of the Jews during World War II. So this person who introduced the Hungarian version of that into Hungary, they wanted to propose the statue and honoring him on both the city that he grew up in, as well as in that was taken in Budapest. That picture was taken in downtown Budapest. The statue was not built due to a lot of international intervention and criticism, but these are recurring efforts in this vein in Hungary. The next slide, please. And even in the West, a Hungarian writer who collaborated, who was an Hungarian anti-Semite, whose works were republished in English translation on neo-Nazi websites up to a year ago, 2 years ago, was honored by a series of events in Hungarian cultural centers in New York and Chicago, Los Angeles. And the Hungarian Consulate General in New York said specifically, while we accept criticism, we respect the sensitivity of those who respect his work and his patriotism. So in other words, giving a green light to honoring and supporting an overtly anti-Semitic writer of the pre and World War II period in Hungary. Next slide. This is just the three table. One is 3 laws in Eastern Europe. I'm not going to go into them. One is the so-called IPN law in Poland. One is the IHRA law in Russia, and the other is in Ukraine. And all 3 have a similar approach where they criminalize, potentially criminalize any criticism of the collaborationist movements or efforts, including, as Jan Gross pointed out, the just simple fact that the Soviet Union, on the basis of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the secret annexes to the pact, agreed to work with Nazi Germany on invading and dividing up Poland to start World War II, at the start of World War II. Any of that mentioned in any of these countries can be lead up to criminal prosecution. Next slide. In the United Kingdom, for example, from the far left, Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader and of the Labour Party, was friends for over 10 years with the gentleman in the suit and tie, who is a notorious Holocaust denier in the United Kingdom, and from and contributed money and was associated with a group of Holocaust deniers for 10 years in the United Kingdom. And let's go quickly through the next slide. In the United States as well, there were attempts. This was an attempt by some of the Polish members of some of these campaign, Jan Zarin and Eva Kurek, to come to a gathering in the United States where they invited congressmen from the United States government to speak without giving their full background and positions to try to influence U.S. Congress. Next slide, please. So this is a woman, Eva Kurek. Eva Kurek, Rafał Pankowski may have more to say about her, who's an Hungarian, Polish anti-Semite and Holocaust distorter. These are some of her quotes. The Polish consulate in New York tried to honor her with an award named after Jan Karski, one of the great heroes of Polish underground, as well as a great friend of the Jewish community. I helped expose this, and they finally pulled back and did not give her the award. But the attempt was to legitimize her work through an award named after Jan Karski on Jewish-Christian, Jewish-Polish friendship. Next slide, please. The JUST Act is the act that all the U.S. Senate passed, which requires the United States government to evaluate and issue a report on restitution of Jewish property and claims for all countries involved in Europe. But some in the Polish community took that as a direct attack on Poland, and that opened up the opportunity for a number of anti-Semitic comments, demonstrations, and you can see, and complaints there. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. In the United States government, even a man, this goes back to the period when Ronald Reagan was president, a man like Patrick Buchanan, who has actually been in contact with Holocaust deniers, repeated and defended Nazi war criminals from deportation for the United States, was a speechwriter in the Reagan White House. And if we fast forward to the infamous Charlottesville demonstration in 2017, where President Trump looked at people and spoke about people who were giving a Nazi salute and Nazi flag and using Nazi slogans as saying they were very fine people on both sides of the that demonstration. And let's go to 2 more very quickly. where again, you could see how, next slide, please. The Proud Boys, go back one more. Go back one, please. The Proud Boys, one of the organizers of the insurrection in January, the storming of the Capitol, had they identified President Trump as, in clear Nazi imagery, as being sympathetic to their cause. And then if we go to the last slide, we will see that among the group who stormed the Capitol was, I don't know if you see the gentleman with the beard and a Camp Auschwitz t-shirt in the back there. And again, the point of this is not to say that everybody is, we can go to the last two slides as well. They're just the IHRA Holocaust denial and distortion definition, which you could find on the IHRA website. But basically, while hardcore Holocaust denial, particularly in the West, in the United States and so on, and France and the UK, has effectively been marginalized now, there is forms of Holocaust distortion which have become politicized, have begun to infiltrate the political mainstream of the Western political discourse. And I think that is the situation that we have to be on guard in, because if it's happened with Holocaust, which is so extraordinarily documented in the heart of Europe, and it could easily be applied to other genocides that are less familiar to the Western public. And with that, I will stop and turn it back to Natalia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your comprehensive presentation. We learned a lot, and the presentation gave us very good insight into the denialist movement. And I think it is very appropriate now to move to the third speaker, who can help us to transfer this knowledge, all this information which we just learned and heard, into different contexts and into different continent, place. And I would like to introduce our third speaker, Professor Rafał Pankowski, who is a professor at the Institute of Sociology of Collegium Civitas in Warsaw. He studies talks at universities in Poland, in the Middle East, in different other countries. He has published widely on various themes, including on Holocaust denial, and he's also published several books on the subject. And he's also a co-founder of a Never Again Association, and he has been a professor at the Center of European Studies at Chulalongkorn University, Bangkok, Thailand, Buddhist College in Thailand, among others. And I would like to invite Rafał to share with us how we can apply those lessons in other contexts, with instances of genocide and violence happening, for example, Bangladesh, Cambodia, and other places, because as I said, we have today very diverse audience in Zoom, but also many visitors watch us through Kova application or through live streaming on Facebook. So Rafał, the floor is yours. And I believe you have 15 minutes. No, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I want to start by saying that the Liberation War Museum is an important site of the global culture of memory, and I am very, very thankful to the museum for hosting this discussion. And I'm also very honored to be on a panel with distinguished speakers and also good friends, Jan and Mark. Both of them have cooperated and supported the Never Again Association over the years. So I feel very honored to participate in this panel with them. I would like to briefly share some thoughts, reflections, observations on the significance of combating Holocaust denial and genocide denial and distortion for the region of South and Southeast Asia. And of course, we know very well that despite the motto "Never Again," instances of genocide have occurred in the decades since World War II, including in the recent past. And the genocide of the Rohingya people is one example of that. Maybe we can show a slide from my presentation, which is later. Yes, thank you. So this is one of the latest examples, unfortunately, of how genocides have occurred in the world, and it was a very sort of special experience for me also after the conference at the Liberation War Museum in 2019, when we visited the refugee camp of the Rohingya at Cox's Bazar, and we experienced the reality of the plight of the Rohingya people firsthand. But what is also important to note is the reoccurrence and globalization of the phenomenon of denial of genocide, and this is something that has also accompanied the post-war cases of genocide, with many of the mechanisms and strategies of manipulation and disinformation similar to those that were described earlier today. But of course, Southeast Asia also has its own history, which is rich and sometimes very tragic, including the genocide in Bangladesh, including the genocide in Cambodia during Khmer Rouge. Next slide, please. And as we can see in such examples, the motto "Never Again" has a universal meaning, or in fact it has multiple meanings and contexts, and we also understood it upon our visits and cooperations in the region of South and Southeast Asia, when we discussed the meaning of the message of Never Again. And one of many examples I can give is a conversation with a judge who is a member of the International Tribunal dealing with the past in Cambodia, dealing with the perpetrators of Khmer Rouge genocide, who told me that he considers his job and his task indirect correlation with the experiences of the judges at the Nuremberg trial. Now I would like to mention a new initiative of the Never Again Association, which is supported by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, that aims to deal with the issue of Holocaust denial and genocide denial and distortion, focusing on the region of Southeast Asia. Currently, we focus on 3 countries, that is Cambodia, that is Thailand and Myanmar, but we very much hope to expand the scope of the project in the cooperation in future to other countries in the region of South and Southeast Asia. What we aim to do is to address the challenges that are complex. One of the challenges is the banalization of Nazi imagery and symbolism in popular culture, which we know is a global phenomenon, but also very noticeable in the region of Southeast Asia. We want to address the challenge posed by so-called multi-deniers. So there are individuals and groups who deny different instances of the Holocaust, of genocide, starting from the Holocaust, but also applying the strategy of manipulation to deny other genocides, including, for example, the Cambodian genocide. And we don't have time to discuss and present them in detail, but one name that some of you may recognize is Israel Shamir. Another name is Jan Myrdal. So these are people who have engaged in both Holocaust denial or distortion and the denial of Cambodian genocide. And of course, denial of genocide in itself is often a form of hate speech directed against minorities, and it is also very strongly linked with different types of conspiracy theory. Next slide, please. So through our project, we don't want to impose any uniform vision of history or interpretation of history, but we very much hope to learn from each other, inspire and exchange experiences through discussions, exhibitions, publications, and our initiative builds on the experiences of the past activities of the Never Again Association in Southeast Asia, including the activities that we conducted in cooperation with Harvey Bell Foundation in Cambodia. And here is an example of one of those very, very interesting seminars in Phnom Penh. Next slide, please. And as you can see in this picture, we also discussed the relevance of the Jan Tomasz in the context of Southeast Asia, and we saw that there was a lot of positive interest and reactions, and the audiences in Southeast Asia could strongly relate to the conclusions, to the findings of Jan Tomasz Gross, which they said also helped them understand the history, the tragic history of their own country. And we believe that through such exchanges, through such type of dialogue, we can actually contribute to a culture of peace, solidarity and intercultural empathy. So this is what the project is about. But last but not least, I would like to emphasize one more point. I think there is a lot of work to be done in raising awareness of World War II as a global event, as part of a common history that also includes the history of Southeast Asia, which I think is often forgotten. Next slide, please. Well, this is a monument built in Kanchanaburi, where thousands of prisoners of war and slave laborers died while constructing the railway for the Japanese occupiers. But there are many other memory sites in Southeast Asia that are related to the history of World War II. And let's not forget that some of the anti-Semitic measures that we know from Europe were also implemented in Southeast Asia. For example, the anti-Semitic propaganda was promoted by the Vichy colonial regime in Cambodia. And I think I can also mention the visit to the military cemetery in Chittagong, where our friend Venerable Lablu Barwa took us in 2019. And the cemetery is very interesting and also very symbolic, because it has graves of soldiers of different faiths who died in what was a common struggle, a struggle against fascism during World War II. So, of course, we know that this discussion is taking place in the context of a global crisis of democratic culture and democratic values, and we know that progress cannot be taken for granted, and it is not a one-way street. As we have learned in Poland in the last years. But I also believe that some of the experiences of dealing with the past in Poland has a long-term they have a long-term value, the value that can also constitute a resource, a positive resource in the construction of a global democratic culture, respect for diversity, human rights, memory rights, minority rights, and also the global culture of peace. And I believe this is very much a common challenge for us in East Central Europe and for our partners in South and Southeast Asia. So I would like to encourage everybody who is interested in the cooperation to be in contact with the Never Again Association. The contact details will be posted in the chat box, and I very much look forward to future discussions and future opportunities for cooperation in this field. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafał, for your very sophisticated and thought-provoking presentation. Very much appreciate. And I believe that we have only a few minutes for questions because we are out of time, but I think that the discussion is very interesting and the speakers are also very important. So, and I see that we have two questions in our chat box. The first question is, what about supporting the denial laws that criminalizes Holocaust denial in many European countries and Israel? Do these laws play any significant role in diminishing anti-Semitism? The first question. And the second question is, can you really compare or relate the situation during Khmer Rouge and Third Reich? The Cambodian people are still in the process of getting justice, and it was a brutal but significant genocide where the Allied powers like the US had both direct and indirect influence. And I think that the first question can be I believe for Mark Weitzman, who can respond very briefly. And the second question can be for Rafał and maybe Professor Gross.
Okay, so I will respond to the first question. Thank you, Natalia. It's an excellent question. As an American, I'll put it this way. I believe very much in the priority of freedom of speech. I don't know if I would have called for laws that inhibit comments or speech. I think there are other ways of dealing with it without necessarily government intervention. I do, however, recognize and respect that laws grow out of particular historical or social circumstances. And the experience of the United States, which did not go through occupation by the Nazis, for example, is quite different from the experiences that Jan described about Poland, or I mentioned about France. And so it is, I think that democratic countries have the right to craft laws to respond to their specific situations, and we have to respect that on a certain level. I don't know if these laws, I will say actually that I don't think they've stopped anti-Semitism in any appreciable way, because we do know that anti-Semitism today is perhaps a greater issue than it has been at any time since World War II concluded. But I think they are important sometimes as statements of kind of a moral policy, that what governments believe in and what they hope that they will create as a norm for the countries that they lead. And I will stop with that.
Thank you very much, Mark. And the second question, maybe Rafał, you can start to.
Thank you very much. No, I think it is a comparison that has been made many times, comparison between Nazi Germany, Khmer Rouge regime. Of course, each case of genocide is special and is different, and the Holocaust was special and unique, and we must also be careful not to trivialize it through too many comparisons, if you like. But I think it is also legitimate to draw some scholars when they are based on facts. And I think there is a lot of facts that suggest that in this case it is actually legitimate to make the comparison. And I have one example which I thought was interesting when I researched the guest book of the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum in Phnom Penh, which is at the site of the Khmer Rouge extermination center S21, and it was fascinating for me to discover that some of the first visitors to the museum were actually Polish, and they left their entries in the guest book saying we can relate to the tragedy of Cambodia because coming from Poland, we know about Auschwitz and we know about the horror of the Nazi occupation from the history of our own country. Therefore, we can relate in a certain way to the history of another country, which is also very tragic. So I think we must be careful with this type of comparisons, but I think there are also cases where comparison is legitimate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafael, for response. And I think we have only 3 minutes left, and I would like to ask Professor Jan Tomasz Gross if Professor would like to respond somehow to these questions.
Thank you very much. I think that Rafael framed it very well, and I really have nothing to add. It's just our knowing about things as they happen in the world is very helpful for us to understand our peculiar situation as it comes about. And genocides have many very strikingly similar features. You know, I've been reading a lot about the genocides in Rwanda, for example, through the works of some wonderful reporters and scholars. And these are stories that could be told about little communities and villages in Poland or Ukraine. So thank you very much for organizing this.
Thank you very much, Professor. And I would like also to express once again the gratitude to the organizers, to the Liberation War Museum for organizing this important event, to our conference. And please stay with the museum and attend the next sessions with HOVA application. So it's possible to be a part of our Zoom session, but also you can join it and watch it through HOVA. And I would like also to add that this conference was organized by the museum, and a great contribution was made by young people, the young generation of Bangladeshis, volunteers of the museum, and our special gratitude also to them. And I would like to ask our speakers, we have 1 minute left, do you have something to say, like last words to the young generation of Bangladeshis?
I will say something just very briefly. I think we're focusing on denial, but I think one of the questions that always has to be kept in mind is, what is the purpose? What are deniers trying to do? And in essence, it's a kind of political question, but it's the rehabilitation of the racism or the extremism that led to the genocide, the act of genocide, is what their ultimate goal is. And it is not just a theoretical conversation, but it is a conversation with practical implications as we live in a world that is growing ever more close as we have social media creating a channel of communication, including propaganda and disinformation. So the question of denial is not theoretical only, but I think it is practical and political. And I think we have to keep in mind what the motives are that they are trying to accomplish that are underlying claims of denial and distortion.
Thank you very much, Mark. So, and if Professor Gross or Rafael would like to add something very, very briefly, 1 sentence, no. So thank you very much for attending our session today, and we hope that we will continue cooperation with museum, and we also learn a lot from you, from your experiences, and let's stay in touch. Thank you very much.